In about a year's time, we're going to have loads of beautiful pictures and video clips to show you. This presentation is all about things we're going to be doing in the years to come, and so it's a little bit short on beautiful pictures and video clips. So forgive me for that. As Marcus said, our project is called ADAPT. This stands for the Adoption of New Technological Arrays in the Production of Broadcast Television. If you're very selective and creative, you can get ADAPT out of that. The principal investigator is John Ellis, who you will all be familiar with, I'm sure. And we're based in the Department of Media Arts at Royal Holloway, University of London. So, in plain English, this project that we're doing is underpinned by a couple of big questions. Fundamentally, how did people use technology to make television? How did technology influence television production? And how did television production influence technology? And the time period that we're looking at is very broad indeed, from 1960 to around about 2010-ish. We haven't quite decided on that yet. So these are big, complicated questions, and we want to ask them about a very long period of British television history. Luckily, we are supported by a very generous grant of just over 1.6 million euros from the European Research Council, which equates, when that grant was paid, to about 1.3 million pounds. This gives us plenty of time to carry out the research. As you can see, we started in August 2013 and we're running until July 2018, which sounds to me like the future. We are a fairly large team. We're going to be a fairly large team. Aside from John Ellis and myself, James Bennett, who also works in media arts at Royal Holloway, will be doing a 2-year project on tapeless workflow, which he will start at some point in the 5 years of the project. And before I move on to talk about what we're actually going to be doing, I want to take the opportunity to plug the fact that we will be recruiting very shortly for 2 fully funded and very generously funded PhD studentships. They're on broadly defined topics. One is on the evolution of tape-based and digital sound recording in British television production. The other is on the transition from 16mm film editing to digital offline editing. I'm happy to discuss these with anybody sort of informally. If you know anybody who might fit the bill for this sort of thing, or indeed you yourself fancy doing a PhD with us, please come and have a chat or pay attention to our website, because we will be advertising very soon, next couple of weeks. I hope we'll be able to get them out. So that's the relatively boring bit over. What I want to do with most of this talk is to talk about what we actually plan to do with this project. As requested by Joe, I want to particularly highlight some of the possibilities and also the problems that we might encounter. So because our project is interested in technologies and technological change, there's a natural tendency for us to gravitate towards innovation and how new things happen. But we want to try to avoid that as far as possible, because we foresee some obvious problems with that approach. New inventions and technological breakthroughs tend to be well documented and well remembered. People easily recall the first time they used a new device or working practice, especially if that new device produced particularly spectacular results, or equally if it broke down a lot. In addition, it's often the case that new technologies are reserved initially for particularly important or spectacular or central television productions. So while understanding how new things happen is important, it's equally important that we avoid producing a history of firsts and failures as experienced by engineers and technicians just at BBC Television Centre. So to remedy this, we want to pay close attention not only to innovations, but also to moments and times of relative stability. We want to understand how arrays of technological devices were combined, such as, for example, 16mm film cameras and synchronized sound recording equipment during the 60s and 70s, to give an example. And we want to understand how different working practices were used in the production of routine, everyday programming, not just the most expensive, spectacular and memorable moments. So we're as interested in Gardener's World as Doctor Who. In fact, we're mostly interested in things like Gardener's World. This presents us with a big challenge, which is how to recover meaningful memories of normal working practices. it can be fiendishly difficult to figure out how television programmes were constructed merely by watching them, and written archives tend only to tell a patchy story of how technologies are actually used. So the key innovation of our research project will be to carry out a series of simulations of historical practices in television production. What we want to do is to reunite veteran television production personnel, including directors, camera operators, sound technicians, production assistants, electricians, and so forth, and ask them to work in teams to use vintage equipment to demonstrate how they would have made television in the past, both the quite distant past and also the relatively recent past. We want to use this process as a means to gather oral historical evidence, and we also want to film the simulations in practice and later make them available as a tool to enable current and future students and scholars to understand the technological circumstances under which old television was produced. So this is a substantial undertaking, and as far as we're aware, it's not something that's been done before with respect to television technology. In order to make a project like this succeed, we need to have a secure understanding of the technology in use at different times. We also need to be able to find working examples of vintage technology or make difficult decisions about substitutions. And we need to find a group of approximately contemporary television veterans to perform the simulation. So just to further highlight the challenge we face, I want to briefly talk through the work we've done so far on our first simulation, which we're aiming to do of 16mm documentary television filming in around about the sort of 60s and 70s. So the first thing I mentioned we'll need is a secure understanding of the technology used at different points in the last 50 years. We found this to be a challenge in itself. As I said, for this first simulation, we're interested in film unit work around the late 60s and early 70s. Now, Marcus was interrogating me at lunchtime about what I was going to say, and when I told him this, he said, well, surely 16mm practice is basically stable and has basically not changed. And to an extent, that's correct. Broadly, we know what it means. It means relatively lightweight 16mm cameras, probably recording audio onto Nagra tape recorders with audio synced to visuals by Crystal Sync. The trouble is, this is about as much detail as most accounts of particular television productions go into, and that's not nearly enough detail on which to base a credible simulation of working practices. We need to know which 16mm cameras were preferred and for which applications. When did people use an Arriflex? When did they use a Bolex? We need to know which particular Nagra recorders were used and whether and when audio mixers were used on location. We need a sense of how much filming was done mute and how much with synchronized audio, and why and who made those decisions. And away from the more obvious equipment, we need to know what film stock was used and what lighting equipment. We also need to understand what union agreements governed the roles different crew members could fulfill. We need to know how long microphone cables were and how long it took to do different things. So we've had some success in uncovering this sort of fine-grained evidence, and we're doing further archival research now to better understand the specific technical environment in which television film crews worked at this moment in history. One of the things we found, very fortuitously in the papers of Westwood Television at the Plymouth and West Devon Record Office, is a full list of equipment taken on a location shoot in Germany in 1970, complete with model and serial numbers. And this is an excerpt from it. This is a really fascinating artifact because it's incredibly detailed. And it's quite comprehensive as well. They took about 15 boxes worth of stuff with them to Germany. And the impression I get is that they were really packing for every possible contingency, because you wouldn't want to get to Germany and discover you'd forgotten a cable or a lens or something like that and have to hire one and have that eat into your tight 3-day filming budget. This also raises for us the kind of imaginary prospect of the historical warehouse of television equipment, where all television equipment ever used has been preserved, and therefore, if we want lens number 9977460, we just have to ask the curator, and they will provide it for us, and rent it to us at a reasonable rate for our historical work. My investigations suggest that this doesn't exist. The other problem, though, with this is that there's hardly any information about how the actual documentary series to which this relates used its equipment. So what we've had to do is try to cross-reference this with papers from a contemporaneous series and start to build an understanding of how kit was used and under what kinds of circumstances. But even the luxury of a list like this doesn't solve our problems, because in order to recreate past working practices, as I said, we need the past technologies. Now, in some instances, that's going to be perfectly realistic. We can borrow old cameras and lenses from collectors, and the same should go for tape recorders. But what about lights? What about film stock, cables? We have to assume that these will be tougher to obtain. And that means we'll have to make some difficult decisions about where and how to compromise. Just as difficult as finding equipment is finding people. And as with equipment, this also means making compromises. So how much does it matter whether or not all of our participants worked for the same broadcaster or production company? How closely contemporary do they need to be? If we can't find a sound recordist to fill that role, can we use a former camera operator to fill it? If we can't do that, what about a willing undergraduate? Where do we draw the line? And given that compromises may need to be made, both in terms of technology and in terms of participants, will we be able to maintain our credibility when working with potentially sceptical TV production veterans? This is a very difficult question for us to answer, and one that we'll only be able to report on after we've carried out our first pilot simulation this summer. The final challenge that we face is to do with what we produce as a result of this effort. Even if everything goes our way and we locate all of the equipment we need in perfect working order and we find a coherent team of production veterans who enthusiastically buy into our project, even then, and once we've done the simulation, filmed it and placed the results online, it's difficult to predict the usefulness of what we've made. Reenactments can't conjure an authentic version of the past. Our simulations will be filtered through decades of memories and half-memories, and they'll be influenced by our own expectations and our own historical work. Will they, as we hope, be found useful aids to the understanding of historical television production? And will the process of carrying out these simulations stimulate the memories of the participants and improve the quality of the oral history work we want to carry out? Again, these are questions that we hope to answer in this process, regardless of its success. So, because so far I've focused on some of the challenges we face, I think there's a risk I'm sounding a bit pessimistic and I think like it's all going to fail. And I don't, that's not true. So I want to be a little bit more optimistic and talk just a little bit about why we think this work is likely to be valuable, and about a few of the other projects which have been shaping our thinking in recent months. Because in recent years, several other projects have been recreating or simulating past television practice in slightly different ways, or gathering oral historical evidence by means of reuniting television personnel with old pieces of equipment. We've been particularly influenced by the recent work of Vanessa Jackson, who is a lecturer at Birmingham City University and also a PhD student at Royal Holloway. She runs this tremendous website, which if you're not familiar with it, I recommend it very highly, in which she's documenting the history of BBC Pebble Mill. Vanessa used to work at BBC Pebble Mill, so she knows, and she runs a Facebook community of veteran Pebble Millers. I don't know what they call themselves. And she's done lots of historical work of different kinds. And one of the things she's been doing when she's been interviewing television production people is she's been interviewing her subjects while they operate old production technologies, so videotape recorders or old outside broadcast trucks. And in a recent article published in the journal View, in their special edition on the hidden professions of television, Vanessa Jackson notes that memory is stimulated by the physical presence of the machinery. The results are often illuminating and surprising. And I say it's well worth visiting her website and looking at some of the videos she's taken of these veteran television people talking to her about the past, literally with their hands on the equipment, and seeing how this brings memories back to them afresh that they wouldn't otherwise have remembered. Another relevant research project that's taken place recently and that will be familiar to anyone who saw it presented at the Spaces of Television conference back in September, which was excellent, will be Andrew Ireland's remake of a contemporary episode of Doctor Who using simulated 1960s production conditions. Ireland placed himself at the centre of what he called a reenactment experiment as its director and recruited television production students to act as his crew. The result was an episode of Doctor Who which exhibited a range of appropriate stylistic and technological constraints, and I found it fascinating to see just how apparently genuine a production could be made by a team of people using modern equipment to simulate the technologies of the past. I think that gives us some cause for hope if we have to make some compromises between finding old pieces of technology and substituting new ones where we can't do. Now, coincidentally, these projects have both recently been highlighted on Ellie Groom's really good blog, Kinney Artifacts, and for further reading, I can recommend this. It comes up on Google if you type Kinney Artifacts. I'm doing that partly because she coincidentally wrote about exactly what I was going to talk about, and I don't want to make it look like I plagiarized her. So go and look at that. Now, both of these projects that I mentioned in their own ways prove the value of the approach that we're seeking to adopt, but I think our aim with ADAPT lies somewhere between Andrew Ireland's experimental reenactments and Vanessa Jackson's hands-on oral history. Ireland's experience suggests that it's perfectly feasible to coordinate a group of people to simulate old TV practices. What we want to do now is replace modern technology with artifacts from the past. Similarly, while Vanessa Jackson has, I think, well demonstrated the value of stimulating memories with artifacts, she's not had the time or resources to extend the work in order to link arrays of technology together, in order to recreate not just the work of a machine, but the work of many linked machines operated by a team. That's fundamentally what's at the heart of the work that we want to do. We don't need to prove to anybody that television technology is important, but there is an important gap in coming up with a very specific, historically grounded history of exactly what kinds of technology were used for what kinds of purpose. And we also want to highlight the way in which technologies are never operating in isolation. They operate as linked arrays, and they are operated by teams of people who work together at different historical moments based on different understandings of standard normal working practices. So this is an ambitious project which we hope will result in a series of filmed simulations, as well as a series of articles, conferences and a book, in order to provide a truly detailed historical account of how TV production has developed and been used, and how TV production technologies have developed and been used since 1960, with a special focus on normal routine methods of working. In addition to the case study of 16mm filming I've focused on, we'll do work on a range of other working methods, including location production to videotape, digital and non-digital portable single camera work. We'll also examine how transitions took place in the realms of sound recording, editing, and tapeless workflow. We're looking forward to reporting our findings over the years to come, and we also welcome your thoughts and input, whether today at this conference or later via our website or Twitter. And I will post some links on our Twitter feed to some of the things that I mentioned today as an incentive for you to all follow us on Twitter and ask us difficult questions there. Thank you very much for listening.